The little girl was the first person to call me Daddy, and I almost walked away when she did. 1 year earlier, her mother had dropped into the chair across from me at a crowded lunch cafe and whispered, "Please pretend you know me. My ex is watching." I thought I was helping a frightened stranger escape an uncomfortable moment, but I had no idea that the man watching us would eventually try to destroy everything we built, or that his own daughter would one day choose me as the father she trusted. Before we begin, if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, and second chances, please like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories to life. My name is Callum Hayes, and at 38, I had become very good at living a quiet life. I worked as a project manager for a small construction company in Portland, Oregon, the kind of job where every day smelled faintly of sawdust, coffee, and rain-soaked pavement. I had never been married, although there had been one woman I thought I would marry. Her name was Elise, and 3 years before I met the woman who changed my life, Elise had ended our relationship with a sentence that stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit: "You're a good man, Callum, but I don't think you know how to let someone need you." At the time, I thought she was criticizing me. Later, I realized she had been telling me something important about myself. I had spent years believing that being strong meant never asking for anything, never needing anyone, and never allowing another person's pain to become my responsibility. So I lived alone in a small townhouse, kept my weekends predictable, and convinced myself that peace was the same thing as happiness. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. I was sitting at my usual table near the front window of a little café downtown, halfway through a turkey sandwich and an email I had already read 3 times, when a woman I had never seen before walked straight toward me. She was probably in her early 30s, wearing a beige coat and holding a little girl's pink backpack against her chest. The child wasn't with her, which struck me as strange. The woman stopped beside my table, glanced over her shoulder, and without asking permission, sat down across from me. Her hands were trembling. She leaned closer and whispered that she needed me to do something that might sound completely insane. When I asked what she meant, she looked toward the glass window, and I followed her gaze. A dark blue SUV was parked across the street. A man sat behind the steering wheel, watching us. She swallowed hard and said, "My name is Mara. That man is my ex. Please just pretend you know me. He's watching." I remember staring at her for several seconds, trying to decide whether I was being dragged into something dangerous. She must have seen the hesitation in my face because she immediately whispered that she wasn't trying to hurt me and wasn't asking for money. She only needed 10 minutes. 10 minutes in which she could finish the coffee she had never even ordered, breathe normally, and convince the man outside that she wasn't alone. I should have said no. Every sensible instinct told me to stay out of another person's relationship problems. Instead, I closed my laptop, smiled as naturally as I could, and told her that I had been wondering when she was going to show up. The transformation in her face was immediate. Her shoulders dropped. Her breathing slowed. And for the next 15 minutes, we pretended to be old friends catching up after years apart. Her ex eventually drove away. Mara didn't immediately leave. She sat there staring at the untouched glass of water between us, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. She told me his name was Grant Mercer, that they had been together for nearly 7 years, and that they had a 5-year-old daughter named Sophie. Grant had become controlling after Sophie was born. At first it was small things, checking her phone, questioning where she had been, demanding to know who she talked to at work. Then came the accusations, the apologies, and the promises that he would change. She had believed him more times than she wanted to admit. Finally, after an incident that she refused to describe in detail, she left with Sophie and moved temporarily into her sister's home. I asked why she thought Grant was following her. She looked at me with the exhausted expression of someone who had been forced to explain the same nightmare too many times and said that Grant kept telling her she could never really escape him. He had convinced himself that if he waited long enough, she would return. She was terrified that involving the police would make him angrier. I didn't tell her that fear was visible in every movement she made. I simply told her that she had done the right thing by leaving. Before she left, she wrote her number on a napkin and hesitated before giving it to me. She said she didn't expect me to understand what she was going through. She didn't expect anything from me at all. She just wanted to thank the stranger who had sat across from her when she needed someone there. I folded the napkin and put it in my wallet. I thought that was the end of it. 3 days later, Mara called me. She apologized for bothering me and said she needed a favor. Her sister had an emergency at work, and she had to pick Sophie up from school, but Grant had been waiting near the building where she was staying. She didn't want to risk being followed. She asked if I could meet her outside a grocery store and simply walk with her to her car. I agreed. Then I agreed again when she needed someone to accompany her to a meeting with a lawyer. I agreed when Sophie needed a ride to a weekend art class because Mara was stuck at work. None of it felt romantic. It felt like helping someone cross a dangerous bridge. And then I met Sophie. She had curly brown hair, a missing front tooth, and a habit of asking questions without waiting for answers. The first time I picked her up, she studied me from the back seat and asked whether I was her mother's boyfriend. I nearly drove into the curb. Mara laughed nervously and told her I was a friend. Sophie considered this for a moment and said, "You don't look like Mommy's other friends." I asked what I looked like, and she shrugged. Like somebody who doesn't yell. That sentence stayed with me. Over the next several months, my life slowly became tangled with theirs. Mara and I started having lunch together. Sophie began calling me when she needed help with a school project. I learned that she hated tomatoes, loved dinosaurs, and kept a tiny notebook where she drew pictures of people she trusted. Mara and I tried to keep boundaries because neither of us wanted Sophie to become attached to something uncertain. But love doesn't always ask permission before it arrives. Sometimes it grows quietly in the spaces between ordinary moments. The first time Sophie fell asleep in my truck after an afternoon at the Science Museum, Mara looked at her through the rearview mirror and smiled sadly. She said she had forgotten what it felt like to see her daughter completely relaxed. I told her that Sophie was a remarkable kid. Mara looked at me and said, "She thinks you're remarkable too." That frightened me more than anything Grant had done. Because I was beginning to realize I cared about them. Then Grant appeared again. He showed up outside Mara's workplace in broad daylight. He didn't touch her. He didn't threaten her. He simply stood across the parking lot holding a photograph of Sophie. When Mara saw him, all the color drained from her face. I was with her that afternoon, and I watched her hands begin to shake. Grant looked at me and smiled as though we were old acquaintances. He said that I was playing a dangerous game and that Mara had a habit of making innocent men believe they could rescue her. I wanted to confront him, but Mara grabbed my wrist and whispered, "Don't." That night, she finally told me what had happened the night she left. Grant had been drinking. Sophie had been in the next room. An argument started, and Grant shoved Mara against the kitchen counter. She had hit her head and fallen to the floor. Sophie had seen everything. The next morning, Mara took her daughter and left. But there was something else. Grant had never known about the photograph. Mara showed it to me the next day. It was an old picture of Grant holding Sophie when she was a baby. Written on the back in blue ink were 6 words, "I will never let you take her." The police eventually became involved, and a protective order was issued. But Grant fought through lawyers and accusations. He claimed Mara was unstable and that I was manipulating her. For weeks, everything became a battle of paperwork, court dates, and waiting rooms. Mara began blaming herself for bringing me into the chaos. One afternoon, she told me that I should leave before Grant destroyed my life too. I told her she didn't get to decide what I was willing to risk. She cried. Then she told me she loved me. It wasn't a dramatic declaration. There were no flowers, no music, no perfect moment. We were sitting in her car outside a family court building, eating sandwiches because neither of us had remembered lunch. She said it quietly, as if admitting it frightened her. I looked at her and realized that sometime between the cafe and that parking lot, pretending had become the least important part of our story. I told her I loved her too. But the biggest twist came a month later. Grant's attorney submitted evidence claiming that Mara had encouraged Sophie to call me Dad. Mara was horrified because she had never done that. She had actually been careful to avoid the word. During the hearing, the judge asked Sophie privately whom she trusted and why. None of us knew what she would say. When Sophie came out, she was holding the same little notebook she used to draw pictures. Inside were pages filled with pictures of her, Mara, and me. And on one page, beneath a crooked drawing of 3 people holding hands, Sophie had written, in uneven letters, "My family." Grant exploded. He accused everyone of turning his daughter against him. But then Sophie said something that silenced the room. She said she wasn't afraid of her father because he was her father. She was afraid because he made mommy cry. She said that when she was with me, she didn't have to listen for footsteps or wonder if someone was going to slam a door. Then she looked at the judge and said, "Callum doesn't make promises. He just comes back." I will never forget those words. The court eventually limited Grant's contact and ordered supervised visits. Mara and I moved slowly, carefully, always putting Sophie first. I proposed to Mara only after months of conversations about what marriage would mean for all 3 of us. She said yes with tears in her eyes, but we didn't rush into a wedding. We wanted Sophie to understand that nothing was being taken from her. We were building something new. A year after the day Mara first sat at my table, I was standing in the kitchen helping Sophie make pancakes when she ran into the room carrying a drawing. She had drawn 3 people standing beneath a bright yellow sun. Mara was holding my hand. Sophie was standing between us. She looked up at me and asked, "Daddy, can we put this on the refrigerator?" The spatula slipped from my hand. I couldn't speak. Mara stood in the doorway with tears streaming down her face. Sophie frowned and asked whether she had said something wrong. I knelt beside her, pulled her gently into my arms, and told her that she had said the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to me. I told her that being her daddy wasn't something I had earned by replacing anyone. It was something she had given me because she trusted me. And then she hugged me tighter. Grant never became the monster I secretly wanted him to become. That was another lesson I had to learn. He remained a complicated, damaged man who made terrible choices and continued fighting his own battles. Eventually, he began attending counseling as part of his court requirements. Mara never forgot what he had done, and forgiveness didn't mean pretending it hadn't happened. It meant refusing to let his worst actions control the rest of their lives. Years later, Sophie would still tell people the story of the café. She would laugh when she remembered that her mother had once walked into a stranger's lunch and asked him to pretend they were friends. She would say that the strangest thing about that day was that none of us knew we were meeting the people who would become our family. Mara and I eventually married in a small garden ceremony on a bright spring afternoon. Sophie carried the rings in a little wooden box she had painted herself. When it was time for vows, Mara looked at me and said that she had once believed love meant finding someone strong enough to save her. Then she realized real love wasn't about being rescued. It was about finding someone who would stand beside you while you learned to save yourself. When it was my turn, I looked at Sophie before looking back at Mara. I told them both that I had spent most of my adult life believing I was protecting my heart by keeping everyone at a safe distance. Then 2 frightened brown eyes had looked across a café table and changed everything. After the ceremony, Sophie took my hand and whispered that she had one more surprise. She led me to a table beneath the trees. On it was an old framed photograph. It was the picture from the café, the one taken by a friend of Mara's shortly after that first strange encounter. In the photograph, Mara was sitting across from me, pretending everything was fine. I was smiling awkwardly, completely unaware that my life was about to change. Sophie had written something underneath it. Where our family started. I stared at those words until my eyes filled with tears. Speech balloon special request: before the story ends, tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were in this situation? If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe for more meaningful and inspiring stories. Your support encourages us to keep creating stories that touch hearts around the world. Looking back, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had chosen that afternoon to protect my own comfort instead of helping a frightened stranger. I could have ignored her. I could have told her that her problems weren't mine. I could have closed my laptop, finished my sandwich, and walked away. And nobody would have blamed me. But sometimes the most important moments in our lives arrive disguised as inconveniences. Sometimes love doesn't enter through a grand romantic gesture. Sometimes it sits down at your table trembling, asking only for 10 minutes of safety. Sometimes family isn't defined by blood, history, or perfect circumstances. Sometimes family is the person who keeps coming back, the person who chooses patience when anger would be easier, the person who stands beside you when your life is falling apart, and the child who looks into your eyes one ordinary afternoon and gives you a name you never thought you deserved. I learned that day that kindness is rarely wasted, even when we don't see its destination. A small act of courage can become a lifetime of love. And sometimes, the second chance we give someone else becomes the second chance our own heart has been waiting for. If you want, I can continue the story with what happened after the wedding, summarize the key themes and messages of the story, explain the emotions and character growth throughout the story.